We're going to begin by introducing ourselves, and I will start out. My name is Dawn Dove, and I'm a Narragansett Elder. I'm a grandmother of 8, soon to be of 10. We're expecting twins. I'm very excited about that. I am a historian and storyteller, and I also am a teacher, educator. Next, Marie.
Thank you. Maria Lawrence, Ramapaugh Lenape from New York, New Jersey. So I'm a transplant here in beautiful Ocean State, Rhode Island. Currently working at Rhode Island College, professor of education and gender studies.
Lorén Spears, Narragansett Niantic, and I'm the executive director at Tomaquag Museum, and soon to be beyond twins. But I also have 3 children of my own, and I am an educator and storyteller and a few other things.
I'm Elizabeth Hoover. I'm an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies here at Brown. I'm faculty advisor for NAM. And I'm Mohawk and Micmac from upstate New York.
My name is Paula Dov Daniels. I'm Niantic, Narragansett. I'm a mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. I'm a storyteller. I am an oral historian and formerly the curator at the Tomaquag Indian Museum. I also, for a period of time, many years ago, worked at Haffenreffer, and I was on their advisory board. And I'm happy to be here today. And even though she's not part of the panel, I would like you all to meet my mother, Eleanor Dove. She's the former owner of the Dove Crest Indian Restaurant, which was in Exeter for 20 years. She and my father ran that for many years. I don't know how many grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren she has because it's too many to count. I also want to acknowledge that our moderator, my younger sister, and this is my niece. So I'm keeping it in the family.
Well, these 4 women up here are quite incredible, and we're very fortunate to have them here to share their insights into Indigenous life and relating that to the themes of love medicine. So we're going to start right off with, I think, our tough topic, our tough theme that runs throughout love medicine, and that's looking at intergenerational historical trauma. American Indians, Indigenous people, experienced massive losses of life, land, and culture from European contact and colonization, resulting in a long legacy of chronic trauma and unresolved grief across generations. This historical unresolved grief contributes to the current social pathology of high rates of suicide, homicide, domestic violence, child abuse, alcoholism, and other social problems. Historical as well as present social political forces exacerbate chronic historic trauma and unresolved grief. In thinking about that, as Indigenous people, as we read this book, Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, it's a difficult read, and I think most people can see that. I mean, there's a lot of heartache within the book, as well as some points of humor. But there's a lot of truth that's being told in this novel. It's a lot of history is being portrayed in this novel. So what I would like to ask, if you could speak to the importance of understanding the concept of historical trauma and historical unresolved grief in order to understand love medicine.
I think, unfortunately, trauma that is intergenerational is, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I apologize. I think it's difficult to talk about intergenerational trauma, mostly because it's cultural based. That is to say that there's the deculturalization process that happened over a course of time that removes those cultural components that are necessary for a cohesive community, that's responsible for retaining values as a culture which is dynamic, continues on its own. And that happened over obviously a long period of time, but the effects are still felt because an incredible part of Indigenous culture is storytelling. I mean, that's really what the novel is about, the stories and how they're being told. And they're difficult stories because there's this component of passing on heritage, but a part of that heritage is also a heritage of sorrow. And it's very difficult to unpack that using Western dynamics of psychoanalysis and other things when, number one, the temporal context is actually very short for Indigenous people, but also there are all of these other vectors that impinge on the Indigenous people that really is a function of breaking down those communities, whether it's going off to school, changes in diets, legislative determination about, even where they can be physically versus ancestral homelands versus being told to walk or migrate to other places. So I think, that's the component of sorrow, is that those are vectors that can't be undone. And the real challenge is finding in a contemporary place, where do we begin to deal with the intergenerational trauma while still hanging on to those really important aspects of culture that do persist.
Thank you, Maria. Could you add to that, Lorén?
Sure. I don't know, where my mind went is sort of looking at where the historical trauma that she just beautifully mapped out was sort of how do we, I don't know if I'm supposed to do this now, but I can't help myself, how do we address these issues today? And so sort of, she did such a beautiful job telling you how we got where we are. And I think programs like within our tribe, GONA, which is a gathering of Native Americans, which is a program that helps to deal with that unresolved grief through intergenerational trauma, through the lateral trauma that falls out, these are funny words, but lateral trauma is like the drug addiction and alcoholism and domestic violence and things like that we didn't have before, that we have now, that may be in mainstream society as well, but have very much broken up our families and our communities due to that trauma. And so programs that we're doing today are helping to resolve that, but it's a beginning process where, in my opinion, even though things have been going on over time, we're still a long way from healing the communities due to that trauma that's befallen us. I'd like you to give, I'm going to pass the ball. I'd like you to give your example again, because I think that's another great visualization of what historical trauma is.
In the past, I had talked about a friend of mine from the Tewa Women United, and they're an organization in New Mexico, Tewa's a Pueblo, and she was trying to demonstrate what kind of this intergenerational trauma looks like and feels like, so that now today, why do you have kids that have so many, this bad attitude, and they have so many problems, and why are they so stressed out, and where is this coming from? And people will say, oh, you should get over it. Those massacres were like 100 years ago. Why are people still, dragging this along? And the visual that she used, she had us go out and collect all these little rocks. And she had bags. And she said, okay, this first bag, this rock that goes into it, this was your great-grandmother. And here's what she suffered, through her life. Maybe she was told she had to speak English. She can't wear her traditional clothes. Those are her rocks. She passes those on to her daughter, who then has other traumas that she adds, and so then more rocks go in depending on what happened in her life. Maybe she's faced alcoholism or abuse. And then she passes those 2 little bags of rocks down to the next generation. So by the time you get to this little kid now who has this bad attitude, you're not sure why, why is he so heavy? He's carrying all of these unresolved issues that his family has passed down because we don't have necessarily the cohesive community mechanisms that were once in place to help deal with these. And so when you're reading this book, you might think like, why are these people so screwed up? Why, when they get together, why do they get drunk and break everything in sight? What is it that compels people to kind of act throughout these different chapters in these ways that seem self-destructive? Why are people acting in this way? And, researchers have looked at what happens when people are constantly under stress and inheriting all those little bags of rocks as a source of stress. And when your flight or fight mode has been activated and there's nothing you can do, you're releasing cortisol. There's this physical response. And when you're constantly releasing cortisol, you become cortisol depleted. And this leads to depression, this leads to addiction-seeking behaviors. And so there's a physiological reality to being handed all those little bags of rocks. And so until you're able to not only unpack your own issues, but resolve, several generations' issues prior, you end up like some of these characters in this book, and they're sort of maladaptive behavior.
Before we continue on, does anyone have any questions in regard to historical trauma, historical unresolved grief? I'd like to go to Paula next, and we're going to look at the theme of land. The theme of landscape of the modern reservation in Love Medicine is one heavily influenced by history, dotted by rock cairns commemorating Indian defeats. The cairns are a symbol of a multitude of issues faced on the reservations as a direct result of the government's genocidal termination, assimilation policies. The scene is one of small land allotments, loss of reservation, poverty, disenfranchisement. While most Americans assume that Native American land rights issues are a thing of the past, in reality, land rights continue to be an issue as the reservation lands continue to dwindle. Local, state, and federal policies continue to be anti-Indian because of the underlying desire for land has not ended. And I'd like you to speak about some of the symbols utilized in Rhode Island as these commemorative symbols.
One of the things that always amazes me when they talk about the Native people, the Narragansetts, the Niantics, that we lost the battle. And we were pushed down to reservation, little spots of land, and actually the Narragansetts were pushed down to the Niantic land, which was all along the coast. And it's something that we, as Native people, have always loved. It's the land that the Creator put us here. We've been here 30,000 years. Now, when I first announced this, I was an intern at the Boston Children's Museum, and I was asked, what's your primary resource? Where are you getting this information? And I said, my grandmother. Well, where did she get it from? Well, from her grandmother. And after at that time, they were saying we had been here about 5,000 years. This was in the 70s. Then they got up to, well, maybe we've been here 10,000. Now they're up to 15,000. And so they're going to realize that this land has been special to us. We honor it, we respect it. And it's not just the land that we walk on. Communities that have, and the invaders that have come in here have cut down hills, chopped down trees, defiled the waters where Providence is sitting right now. There were clam beds and scallops. And yet they wonder why when there's a big hurricane, the water comes so high. It's built in the wrong place. Native land across the country is now, again, under attack for things like fracking, oil, gas. It affects the water, It affects the game that we might still be surviving off of. Many a time as a child, growing up in Charlestown, if my dad didn't go out and get some rabbits or shoot a deer, there wasn't much meat on the table. And so that feeling of lost is always there with us. It doesn't go away because we still love this land. Coming up the hill today, coming up Waterman Street, my niece was driving and I'm thinking back, what was it like 600 years ago? What were the trees? What animals were here? And now there's all buildings and light and tar and cement and bricks. And yet underneath all that are my ancestors, her ancestors. So it's all very special. And we never stop loving it, even if we can't use it, even if we can't live on it. It's part of us. We come from it and we'll go back to it.
Thank you, Paula. Maria, could you speak to us a bit about why the Kachiri Faith is such an important issue to tribal nations today?
Yeah, I will try. The Kachiri Faith, as it calls, comes from a Supreme Court decision that was made. And basically, there are a lot of legal terms associated with indigenous tribal experiences in the courts of America and with the federal government. But one thing is absolutely true from the earliest decisions in the 1830s straight through to the present, is that there's a deterioration in the interpretation of existing treaties and existing law around indigenous sovereignty, the amount of sovereignty that nations have that are called domestic nations. And part of that comes from the use of the word trust. Trust has been used within the legal system to slowly degrade and chip away at, if you will, the sovereignty status. So there were a number of things that were done once Congress abolished treaty making, and that was back in the 1930s, about 1930s. And some of the earlier decisions from 1823 up to about 34 dealt with those issues of sovereignty. And for those nations that were recognized, quote unquote, as having nation-to-nation, historic nation-to-nation interactions with the federal government, they were allowed to work with mechanisms within the federal government to preserve and protect their lands. And one of those mechanisms is to have the BIA or the Interior Department hold lands in trust on behalf of nations. Well, what has happened over the course of time, as you all know, is that nations that have always been sovereign through the process of the Creator were detribalized. And the Narragansett or the Nahaganset were certainly detribalized. And the retribalization, which is really the re-recognizing of nation-to-nation relationships, happens through a process that is legislatively called the recognition process. Well, from the time that began, which I think was around 1978 to when it was completed in 1983, the Nahaganset Nation stands as a nation with nation-to-nation relationships with the federal government. And so those mechanisms and processes that were in place for holding lands in trust were used by the Nahaganset, as they were by any other nation that is sovereign and interacting with the federal government. Unfortunately, that was challenged by Governor Kachiri's administration, which is why the outcome has been called the Kachiri Fix. And basically, that was all of that language was set in place by, I want to say 1834, which is typically called, the Indian New Deal, or IRA, which is the Indian Reorganization Act. And that was designed specifically to try and make some amends at what had been previously referred to as termination actions on the part of the federal government. The impact, the cascading impact on the Nahaganset contemporarily was for the state of Rhode Island to challenge that. And this was a really aggressive challenge. I don't think people fully appreciate even to today, because when it was first challenged, that those lands should not have been held in trust for the Narragansett, because they really weren't, quote unquote, a recognized tribe according to the 1934 Act. The courts ruled yes. And I think there were 3 or maybe even 4, if I remember correctly, appeals on the part of the Kachiri administration over a period of, 10 years, which is a huge investment. I mean, that's why I say it's aggressive. If you think about that period of time and how much it must have cost and how much effort it took to try to go as high as the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, even though the final outcome was the only contrary, the Supreme Court decision was the only contrary determination. Prior to that, all of the other appeals had indicated that the Narragansett did indeed, as a tribe, have the right to have the BIA hold those lands, the interior, hold those lands in trust. And it finally got to the Supreme Court, at which point, I'm trying to remember which justice wrote the final statement. Was it, no, I think it was, it'll come to me. It's been a long day. But the final determination was that no, there was a complete reversal. And that reversal emanates, believe it or not, from trials and determinations by the Supreme Court back in 1834 around the word trust, that it was inappropriate for the BIA or the Interior to hold those lands in trust because, according to the language of the law, lands could be held in trust in 1834 from using the word now, for tribes now.
1934.
Oh, excuse me, 1834.
The IRA is from 1934.
Oh, excuse me, right, thank you, 1934. And it was that particular phrase because of the use of the word now. And so it was interpreted that now would mean from that point back in time versus now moving forward in time. And so that has stood as one of those things, because really all the Supreme Court decisions deal with either trust or commerce, which goes back, as you all know, to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution of the United States. So that's referred to as the Kachiri Fix, because what that determination did was it really undid an element of sovereignty, which is what I meant before that. Apparently, within the legal construct, it's conceivable that you get these decisions that can interpret the prior laws very differently to chip away at those elements of sovereignty that you would think full nations, right, a full expression of sovereignty that nations would have.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Maria. That was very insightful. Anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask at this time?
I have a question. So, can you, I don't need the real numbers, but, I mean, there are many Indian tribes across North America. So, of the ones that were recognized at that time, what proportion of Native Americans does that include? So how many people were left out of that? I mean, how many people are fighting for their own identity now?
So you're asking how many have this ruling affected other nations in addition to the Narragansett?
Yeah, sure, there has to be a lot of them.
There's actually a lot of nations. I don't know the exact
It's over
number.
200.
No, but I mean, is it like
It's
half
over.
of the total population of
Well,
the
there's
American?
560, I believe, federally
Yeah.
recognized tribes. And they're I didn't hear what she said. Oh, yeah, 560. So over 560 federally recognized tribes. And the thing is that with the Kachiri versus Salazar and the notion of the word now, as Maria mentioned, the silliness of it is that the Supreme Court has defined the word now to mean now, that moment in 1934 and before, but not after. And the reason why I explain it as being silly is if we say an event's going to start now, you mean now and going forward. And a perfect example, which a good friend of mine gave, was we've all seen a wedding, been in a wedding, watch the wedding on TV, and the preacher gets up there and he says, and I now pronounce you husband and wife. If we went by the Supreme Court's definition of now, that person would be married for that split second they were married. Any time before that they might have been married, but not a moment after. And that's what I go along with most people in Indian country and call legal genocide. They will find every little loophole they can find to undermine what their responsibility is, which is to uphold the trust relationship between tribes and the federal government.
But to get back to my question a little bit, was of the entire population of Native, North American Native Americans, how many, is it 50%?
I don't know the answer. I don't know if anyone on this board does, but I can tell you this, that in 1934, which they're referencing the Indian Reorganization Act, there were many tribes that weren't federally recognized or acknowledged because they weren't even states yet,
Right.
as in Alaska and Hawaii, and I don't
Texas and Arizona.
So
and
the list
we
goes
go
on.
and on.
And do you think that we took a trip out west, we circled the Grand Canyon, and so we were in Navajo lands for a very long time, and it was very, very interesting. We went to the Rock, which has their administrative center and stuff, and the museum and stuff, and it seemed like they were functioning as their own government. And is that what you mean? That's one of the things they are allowed to do because they were already recognized? I'm going to guess that they were recognized at the time. Or is it just in a legal sense that they're at least able to do that?
Well, we all have our own government. It's about the trust relationship and the responsibility of the federal government in that relationship to tribes and putting lands into trust and protecting them, because the whole purpose of the trust relationship was to stop errant states and individuals from usurping the land. That was the whole purpose to begin with, was to protect that right.
I'll give you an example. In Charlestown, we purchased some land. We received some funding, we raised money, and we had built houses for seniors. And the town of Charlestown protested that land being into trust. We had a whole list of people that were supposed to have these homes. If not all, almost all are now deceased. His names are on the list. The houses have fallen in among themselves. We have tried several times to get it back into trust. And the town of Charlestown thought, even though this is out in the middle of nowhere, without a highway, major highway anywhere near, that we were going to put a casino on this piece of land. So they fought us tooth and nail. They're still fighting us about having this housing there. But what has come back to bite them? There's a law within the state of Rhode Island that every town, community has to have a certain amount of sort of low-income housing. And Charlestown, if they had been on the ball, would let us have had our housing there, and they'd have almost met the quota. Now they've spent $150,000 on planning and found out now they're not going to get the funding for this housing. They were going to have 2 places in Charlestown. So they keep cutting off their nose to bite their, their own lip. And it's the same thing has happened with our efforts to have a casino, not on our reservation, but we had towns that were willing to work with us. Now we have outsiders that have come in, they're running the casino, we get no accountability from the state or from the casino. Monthly it should say what the take is, where the money's going, how the state is using it. There's no respect. How much is going outside of the state. Yes, they're employing some Rhode Islanders, but you can be sure the big bucks, it's not here in Rhode Island.
Thank
So
you.
essentially when land goes into trust, just to explain, the federal government rules apply to it, but the town or the state doesn't. So there are some communities that don't want tribes to put land into trust because it takes it off the local tax roll. So there are other communities that are fighting land claims, that are saying, essentially the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790 said that after 1790, states and individuals couldn't take or buy land from Indians, only the federal government did. And states like Massachusetts and New York and Rhode Island did take and buy land from Indians, who are now going back and saying, well, those transactions were legal, we need to go to the courts and see how much of this land we can get back. And towns are gonna panic, even if it's land that nobody lives on, because then that removes that land from the tax roll. You're not paying state and local taxes on that land. But it also means that in the future, other people can't take that land from the tribe, which is why tribes want to have land in the trust.
Yes.
Are there efforts underway to challenge? I sure would like to know which Supreme Court did that, and it's got to be fairly recently, it's only under Cartier. Are there efforts underway to challenge that at the federal level?
It's affected so many other tribes, so they're coming into play. So it's being challenged not just by the Narragansett, but by other Native nations across the country.
And because the Indian Reorganization Act was an act of Congress, it actually has to be changed as in Congress, which right now is going to be a bit of a challenge. But that's where it actually has to change. Because they have to change, they have to redefine the terminology of the word now in that act, which is what the Supreme Court decided on. So that's where the stickiness gets, and depending on who's running for re-election and what's going on in their world is whether they'll come together and actually do what's right.
All right. I know this is a topic we could go on for quite some time, but going back to the book, we also know that she covers many themes. So I want to take a moment to look at tradition versus modernization. Erdrich tackles the theme of conflict between traditional ways of living and increasing modernization. Lorén, could you please discuss how we struggle to continue the traditional ways of living as modernization engulfs us?
Sure. Well, the way I like to look at it is what my grandfather always said to me, is that we have to live in this world, but we have to have one foot in each canoe. And so if you know anything about standing up in canoes, you need a lot of balance. And if you're balancing one foot in two different canoes, you need an extreme amount of balance. And I think as Indigenous communities, believe it or not, we're doing that fairly well. We're balancing our culture, our tradition, our heritage, our language, our ceremonies, our way of being, our way of knowing how to live, and yet balancing this modern world. And whether that's incorporating hunting, fishing, gathering, traditional cooking, traditional arts, weaving, beading, finger weaving, pottery, whatever, integrating that into our lives on a daily basis and then passing that down to our children. In thinking about the balancing of modernization, I have three children. My oldest is 19, 17, and 13, so I've got the three teens going here. And what I like to see, and when I look over here at other tribal members who have children in that sort of young adult zone, is you might think that the modern world is sucking them up and taking them away from culture and tradition, but really what I'm seeing is just the opposite. I'm seeing the children and youth in our community being very connected to culture while being exposed and connected to modern day things, such as your iPhone. But I'm seeing, I have a young man in the tribe that's a friend of my son's. All of a sudden now he's my new friend. And he's always texting me in Narragansett because he wants to learn more. So he's always writing to me in his texting, Askawikwasan and Sun Kunai, and talking to me in Narragansett via text. But the kids are also using that technology to record songs. I have an intern at Tomaquag Museum who's Narragansett, and she's interviewing Native artists. And not only that, but she's an artist and a musician, and so she's incorporating traditional culture into her artwork and into her songs. Her latest song is in English, and it's talking about modern stuff that's happening to kids. And then partway through, she just weaves in all this Narragansett language, but it's about her as a Narragansett teenager. And her life ties those things together. It ties, modern music with traditional music, English language with Narragansett language, traditional arts with contemporary arts. And so I feel that our kids are really, maybe even doing it better than I did at their age, of balancing the culture and tradition and the modernization of the world.
Thank you. Liz, let's move on to the theme of food. Food is utilized throughout love medicine, lots of pie throwing and who knows what else. Please describe procurement and preparation of traditional foods and how they are used to sustain us culturally and spiritually.
I don't know if any of you have read her other books, but Tracks she wrote after Love Medicine, but chronologically it comes before Love Medicine. And so it's in the kind of late 1800s, early 1900s. And it talks about, especially about the absolute reliance on the local land for food. And so this was an era where most people were going out hunting. And then the switch over to a time when people's land base was really being shrunk. So people went from, spending all winter hunting moose and all summer fishing and, planting some food, going out for wild rice. So if any of you have been out through Minnesota, that's kind of the big staple food there. And it's essentially a grass that grows out of lakes, and people will be in a canoe, and you have a guy in the front pulling along, sort of like those guys in Venice, very slowly. And then the guy in the back has two sticks, and one he'll use to bend the grass over, and the other one are called knockers. The other one taps so then the rice falls into the canoe, and then they bring it back, and they'll take it all out of the bottom of the canoe, and they'll parch it, they call it. So these big metal drums, and they'll have over the fire, and you have to shake it because you can't burn it. So just shaking it, and then you have to kind of winnow out all the chaff, and then you can actually buy that online in the stores now. People still go out and do that. So it's not the same as the, Whole Foods or Trader Joe's wild rice, which is actually cultivated on lakes and picked by machines and doesn't taste anywhere near as good. It takes forever to cook, as opposed to the hand-parched stuff, which will cook in about a half hour and it's wonderful and tasty. So that was a staple that people had for a long time. And throughout Tracks, you see the impact of when that land base is cut down and those animals diminish as other people come into the territory, and you start to rely more on commodity foods, so flour and a couple of potatoes, and there's real periods of starvation. And that happened in a lot of Native communities when land bases were shrunk, and people had to get creative with these commodity foods. This is where we get fry bread, which today everybody's like, oh, it's such a delicious food, and it makes us happy. It's like fried dough, basically, and people's grandmas make it to cook with soup, and you sop it up, and it's this delicious stuff. Real artery busting kind of food. And so it's sort of a food that came out of poverty and need, but the people have adapted as this home style type food. It's not nearly as healthy as the foods it replaced, obviously, in most communities that rely on commodity foods. And so now, as you see real kind of periods of starvation in Tracks, and then up through Love Medicine, there's sort of efforts of people to try to gather over food to try to kind of mend some of these broken relationships. And just mentioned the pie throwing, it kind of goes awry when people start drinking and gathering around food. But in Ojibwe communities today, there's this effort to get back to some of these traditional foods. So for a while, there was real controversies around spearfishing, because that's something that Native people have done forever. But sports fisher people in the Wisconsin and Minnesota were worried, what will this do to the numbers? People looked back to the treaties and said, we have the right to do this, we're going to keep doing this. So there was big shootouts and brouhaha over that, and the government said, no, they have the treaty right to do this. So things have settled down a little around that. But there's also the White Earth Land Recovery Project run by Winona LaDuke. I don't know if any of you have heard of her. Fantastic lady. They're trying to bring back some of these heritage seeds. And so she grows this pink lady corn that's amazing. It's this bright, shocking, bright pink corn that's very different from the sweet corn and the corn that you get in the store, or the stuff that's used to make high fructose corn syrup. And so there's another organization I worked with for a while called Dream of Wild Health that takes kids, inner city Indian kids from Minneapolis and St. Paul, out to a farm where they learn how to grow these heritage seeds and become more involved in food production. So there's definitely an effort happening now of people recognizing, how can we get more of these traditional foods back into our contemporary diets so that we will be healthier.
Well, let's take a look now at family, which is certainly a major theme throughout Love Medicine. The characters in Love Medicine have a very have very strong ties to their extended families and culture. For example, while Albertine has chosen to leave the reservation to study nursing, she is drawn back home upon hearing about her Aunt June's death. Back on the reservation, Albertine wants to connect with her grandfather, hoping to understand more of her culture. She asks him questions about his days as an advocate for Indian rights. The other characters also tell their stories through their relationships to June. Thus, the familial bonds provide a common thread throughout Lev medicine. Could you please share with us how you have connected with your grandparents or extended family, hoping to understand more about your culture?
I grew up with a mother and father who had a phenomenal work ethic. They always had jobs. And sometimes their jobs would prevent them from caring for my brother and I, who were the first two born children. And we'd live some of the time with my grandmother Dov in Westerly. Other times we'd live with my grandmother Spears in East Providence. And at other times, we lived with cousins who lived a few miles down the road from us. And it was Aunt Grace and Uncle Russell. It was always extended family. My parents always had someone else coming in. They had a bed, a place to eat, a place they could wash their clothes, they could bathe. That intergenerational thing just happened over and over. We lived out in Charlestown, and at the end of the week, on Fridays, we would go to town. Going to town was going to Westerly. My parents and mother, my mother and father would do their banking, their grocery shopping, and so forth, and then we'd end up at my grandmother Dov's house. And she had a big round oval table, and it was set. And if there were 8 of us, she'd have the table set for 9. What was the 9th place for? There's only 8 of us here, right at this time. Well, the unexpected guest. And there was not one time when somebody, unbeknownst to us, who didn't come in, who was considered part of the family. It was always intergenerational. It was always children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, cousins. It might be someone who's just alone, and it was just part of how it happens. Right now, I'm living in my mother's house, and on one side is my son and his 2 sons and his daughters. It's 4 generations right there. It's just part of who and what we are. We think nothing of it. When I lived at my father's cousin Grace, who was married to my mother's cousin Russell, there was not only there at that time perhaps 6 kids, my brother and I, there were also a cousin, Alice, lived there. Whoever came in was loved. They were allowed to be a place to sleep, to get clean, have their hair washed, share the clothing, share the bedding, share what food there was. And it was just all about love. And we hear the stories from the elders. They would start talking about remember when. They'd be playing music. And it was just all part of our culture. And it hasn't stopped. And that's the beauty of it. We may get away from it. I have lived all over the country, from California to Michigan to Mississippi. You name it, I've been there, upstate New York. My feet keep coming right back to be with family, because that's what it's all about.
Thank you. In thinking about that, Maria, and anyone that would like to answer this, as you left your reservation to pursue your education, what continues to draw you back home?
Family. Family and land. You know, that sense of belonging is also what I call place identity. You know, there's just, it's hard for me to explain, especially since things like Jersey Shore have been televised, but it's a really great feeling for me to travel from Rhode Island, heading south along the coast, and then hitting the Tappan Zee Bridge. I will never be able to explain a sense of relief and lightheartedness when I see the Palisades on the other side of the Hudson. Because the Ramapaugh Nation, while we reside now in New York and New Jersey, we were very much a Western Connecticut nation, and we were pushed to the other side to reside permanently in what is now politically, New York and New Jersey. So moving through Connecticut for me is, especially moving in that direction, southwest, is just a really wonderful reaffirmation of who I am, where I come from, my ancestry, the type of environment that my ancestors were raised in and that I was raised in. And so we've always been a coastal as well as a mountain people by heritage. So I enjoy being on the coast, and I love it, but then I also love continuing across that Tappan Zee, right on into Ramapaugh Mountain territory, which you all refer to as the highlands of New Jersey. And it's just wonderful being in that space. But it's also made wonderful because when I get there, well, quite frankly, everybody looks like me, which is nice. I don't even have to say who I am. People go, oh, you're DeFries. Well, and literally you pull into these, that's my maiden name. And you pull into these little communities that are definitely Ramapaugh communities, but the name on every mailbox for 5 streets is DeFries, 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 DeFries. And if you do the history and you go back and you look at the school rolls, and you can see in this one-room schoolhouse, 27 children named DeFries. And so it reflects that sense of community by location, which gets back to some of the conversation about land and sovereignty, and what does it mean to be community, and how do you maintain it, which also speaks to how young people now, through enhanced technologies, can still reach back into spaces and places that were a little bit more challenging prior to those types of technologies. So when I think about being home, and I think about family, I think about where I come from, because that's still where many of Ramapaugh reside. And we all, right, your feet always come back here, my feet always end up somewhere around the Hudson, quite frankly. And but so do so many of my cousins and my sister. And I still have family who live there, as well as having family who live in other parts of the world, different countries. But we all come home, whether they're in New Zealand or wherever. We know that around the time of powwow and other important tribal events that have been long-standing and traditional, we come together as a physical community. So that's basically how I would answer.
Thank you. Another theme, individual versus society. In addition to their ties to family, the characters in Love Medicine feel the importance of their culture. They try to live in contemporary society while keeping their Anishinaabe traditions alive. Lorén, could you share with us how you or some members of your family try to live in contemporary society while keeping your Indigenous traditions alive?
Well, I think we've had great examples. My grandmother, my mother, extended family. How we do that is by doing what we do. My kids don't even think of it as something, especially when they were a little bit younger, as something that we did because we were Narragansett. It was just something that we would do. That's walking our lands. It's gathering things like cranberries and other berries and mushrooms and going out in the salt ponds and quahogging and oystering and clamming and crabbing and going down to the beach and doing ceremony at certain special times, going to August meeting, which is the oldest recorded Native gathering in the whole United States, 338 years this year. Something that's been going on since time immemorial, something that we do, but what the public sees is one part of it, but what we feel amongst ourselves is a whole nother part of it. I mean, I just love going there, going down to the spring and getting a drink during August meeting as well as other times in the year, but particularly then, and seeing all the different family that's come home during that time. So, you know, I think we spend a lot of time being connected to who we are because that's just who we are. So when we're hunting, fishing, gathering, doing traditional arts, I personally love to do a lot of traditional arts, and I like to teach other kids in our community or my own children traditional arts, and sometimes the ones that are closest to you, they do it and then they think they take it for granted, but then they get a little older and they come back to me, and not only students that I've had that are Native, but also my own children or nieces and nephews that get a little older and they come back to me and they go, oh, remember when you taught me how to do such and such when I was like little and I've completely forgotten about it? Can you show me again now, because now I'm really interested? We all go through that as kids and young adults. We have to find ourselves. But me personally, I just, you know, I love to do traditional arts. I love doing the job that I do, which I think very much integrates my culture and tradition. Being a director of a Native American museum allows me to sort of be in my culture all the time. Now granted, sometimes I'm grant writing and sometimes I'm doing drudgery of other sorts, but it's still all connected. So I'm able to think about books like Love Medicine and the themes that are in it, and work with wonderful people like on our panel, and work with traditional artists like Alan Hazard and Brenda Hill, who does pottery, and they come into the museum. So not only can I do all these things on a personal front, but I can do them on a professional front as well, and I'm especially blessed for that opportunity. So I find I try to incorporate it. I think we incorporate it every day in our lives, no matter what we did. When I worked in public school as a teacher, you are who you are. So those things are incorporated. I'm just extra blessed right now because I can spend even more time doing things that I feel are important to me as a human being, as a Narragansett, as a cultural person. So,
Thank you. And then we're going to look at the theme of home. It is important to point out that during the last 4 centuries, Indigenous nations were made to relocate their homes repeatedly by the United States government. The loss of homeland for Native American tribes has had tragic consequences, as the homeland is connected with the spirituality and traditions of all tribal nations. That is why the Native American heroism in literature is not based on the courage to leave home and search for the American dream, but on the bravery of fighting to preserve the home in the shape it is supposed to be, according to the traditions and spiritual continuity of the tribe. Liz, could you speak to this point? How do we as Indigenous people connect to our homeland spiritually and traditionally?
I think it's very different for different tribes, depending, again, if you've been relocated, if you haven't. I mean, Mohawk people are in the same general vicinity. We moved north a bit over 300 years. That American Revolution problem, a lot of people sided with the British instead of the Americans, and that didn't work out so well, but the British lost, which I know everybody gets really excited about on 4th of July, but some people didn't fare so well in that little battle. And so, but we're lucky to still be at least in the same region of the country. And so people didn't have to shift a major climate, and still, you know, we're able to grow the same foods in southern Canada as in upstate New York. The climate's not that different, and that's one way that people really kind of connect spiritually, is being able to have ceremonies around, especially, you know, for Haudenosaunee people, the growing cycle is especially important. So when the thunders come, when the strawberries come, when the sap runs in the trees, when the beans grow, you know, there's all these different ceremonies, and so, you know, and they're set around when these things happen in nature. So for tribes like the Cherokee Choctaw, those folks in southeastern U.S., you know, in the Georgia, North Carolina area, they got marched all the way out to Oklahoma. That's a completely different climate. And so there's stories of, you know, women who brought these seeds with them, kind of tucked in their skirts, and then find that they don't grow the same in dry, dusty Oklahoma that they do in South Carolina. The same for the Pawnee were relocated kind of through the Midwest down into Oklahoma. And there's a woman named Deb Echohawk who's been working on trying to bring back these heritage seeds, which is tough when you're in a different climate. So they actually had a medicine bundle that was repatriated to them. So museums that receive federal funding are going through this NAGPR process where they have to, if they have sacred objects or burial items, they have to give them back to the tribes that they were taken from. So the Pawnee got one of these medicine bundles back, and it had seeds in it that they really wanted to see if they could sprout. But they wouldn't survive in Oklahoma. So she actually had to partner with a lady farmer in Nebraska, I think, who helped her to grow out some of this corn in the climate for which it was adapted before the Pawnee were moved. And now they're working on gradually kind of creating a strain of this corn that will survive in Oklahoma. And so it's been part of that adaptation because like I said, a lot of these ceremonial cycles are built around being able to grow your food in that way.
Thank you, and we'll continue on with that topic. Paula, could you think about how the loss of title of land affects us spiritually and culturally?
I grew up in Charlestown, deep in the woods. My father, my grandmother, other elders in the tribe would go for walks. And as we walked along the different trails and paths, they would point out different herbs, medicines, the types of twigs we used to brush our teeth, the wild mint to freshen our breath, different medicines. They were all right there. And they knew how to use them. And what has happened with our land base, people see, oh, this is a beautiful spot. Cut down all the trees, chop down the bushes, and put up development there. And people move in, and they're all in these little houses, and they've got grass, and they might put some shrubs, and they might plant, not an indigenous tree, but something that's pretty and attractive to them. And they don't realize the loss that has gone along with the herbs and the wild things and the roots and the berries and the things that were needed for medicines and were needed to cleanse and to need for spiritual purposes. When you know that over 70% of the medicines that's recognized by the United States Pharmaceutical is medicines derived from the people, the indigenous people of North and South America, and these same medicines are now used worldwide, but yet we can't go out and get them. We have to go into CVS where they've been polished and waxed and additives have been put in it and then put in a little box, but they cost more than we can afford, and it's a loss for us. It's something that just goes on and on. There were things we didn't have. Obesity. We didn't have rats here that carried disease. We didn't have the common house plot. We didn't have jails. There were many things we didn't have, but we had a good life. And we got up every day. We didn't have to go to a building to pray. We could go outside, we could greet the sun, we could greet the moon, see the stars. It might be a special tree. This tree in my mother's backyard, it's a pine tree. My son hates it. He says, the sap, needles. I said, sorry, that's my tree. I pray to that tree. I'm not praying to the tree, but it's a place where I connect the grandfather sky and the earth, and it's part of my being. And I share this with my children and my grandchildren. And I want them to know and honor this land. So when we lose part of our land, we're losing part of ourselves. And we keep trying to go back and find it. And this is, I think, for all indigenous people. So that's why we have that good connection. We know the loss is there, but we still honor it. We still respect it, and we still love it.
And the last The last theme that we will look at is ancestors. The spirits of our ancestors reside in this place, and we carry their DNA within us. Our ancestors carry the traditional memories and are able to help to create the identity of the living ones, our children, our young people, and help keep the traditional continuity of the culture of the tribe. Marie, could you please speak about generational connections and how they are maintained?
I think to be honest with you, my knee-jerk response for generational connections are always the stories, the family stories, the community stories. That's the first thing. And the reason why it's the first thing is because we live those stories, you know. And I think that's a critical part of this particular book. Is I think of the character Lulu in the book. She's somebody who has, in many ways, an old spirit. She's always wanting to use the old language, to think about the old ways. There are so many moments in time, in all of the mayhem. The thing that connects everybody is, for all of the things that are crazy around them, there's the fact that they have each other. No matter what, they have each other. As crazy as they are, as crazy as everything is there's the connection that they share, and the fact that they have common lives and they have stories that connect them and keep them connected. But the other thing that goes along with those stories are the performances of those stories. Sometimes the stories are told at different times for different reasons. Our stories are also our legal system. So rather than, turn to a child and say, no, you should never do that, you might get a story instead. that is a lesson on etiquette, or is a lesson on how to behave, or what to say, or how to act. And so that's, when I think of those things that connect family, I think of that, and then I always think also of food. Because so many of those stories happen. I can remember once doing research somewhere and speaking with an advisor who happened to be Cherokee, and I turned around and I said, all of that's well and good, but I still have to be able to enter those kitchens after I'm done. And what that meant is I still need to be able to go back as who I am and reconnect with all of those people, which is always a challenge when you're an Indigenous researcher researching your communities, is that you have to make sure that you honor the fact that you're first a member of that community, and that what you're doing is really something that is outside of that community, so that you don't hurt or damage those relationships and connections. So I tend to think of those things first and foremost.
Thank you. And Lorén, finally, how is oral tradition utilized to help keep the traditional continuity of the culture of our nations?
Well, the way I look at it is this, Maria talked about it very nicely about that it's all framed around a story. And so oral tradition is exactly that. It's telling the story of who we are, how we exist, what our beliefs are, what our sort of mores of our society is. And it's up to the children today to pass that on to the next generations to come. We often say 7 generations, because that's like saying to the children today that they have to pass it out not to just their children and their grandchildren, but their great-great-grandchildren, which is an awesome responsibility to go. I think I missed a couple greats even. Forgot the other 2 fingers. But the idea that they have to push it out that far, that means they can't be selfish. They can't just think about themselves. They have to think about what their impact is going to be in passing along everything from her and what she's passed on from those before her, from her to me, to my children. And so I have a responsibility. Each one of us have a responsibility, and that connects us one generation to the other, and that's all through that oral tradition. In this modern era, we might write down some of that oral tradition to perpetuate perpetuate it in a different way, but it really comes, the real lessons come from what's said, or maybe even what's not said. Because believe me, I can read my grandmother. It doesn't take much. A couple of little frown lines, and I'm like, okay, something went wrong there. Let me snap into shape, you know? But, you know, I think we all, no matter who we are as human beings, we have those kind of connections. But I think in our families, that oral tradition about who we are and how important that is as Indigenous people is passed down from one generation to the other. And I see it with the youth. We have a beautiful youth coming up, and I feel that they feel very strongly about this, and they're very connected. And hopefully, we as the adults here are strong enough to help them along so that when it's their total responsibility to push that forward, they're ready and prepared. And so the real responsibility lies on all of us sitting here.
Thank you very much. Now, any questions? It's your turn. Sure.
I read a lot of Louise Erdrich, so I don't remember what it was. But one of the most powerful stories that she tells is about what happened in the Christian schools for Indian children. And I know that one of the things that was a real stripping away effort to destroy traditions and create barriers between generations. And one of the things that happens with that is the loss of language. And I wonder if you all speak your own Indigenous languages as well as English. It seems to me that you do. And how that works, the language issue.
Well, in my own community, we have a language program. Currently, my mother is the language teacher. We have a whole committee of people, elders that are older than her, that act as consultants that talk for her, Elasikatau, for example. I think that, you know, that history, that legacy of why language has been usurped in some ways within our communities because of the historical legacy is there. And, you know, I like to say we're at varying levels of fluency in the sense that from my own perspective, in our own community, as one elder said to me, so long as one person is speaking one word of our language, but in our community we really have a lot more than that. Because of songs and ceremonies, there's words, greetings, and mild dialogue, I'll call it. There's language going on. Is it a fully fluent experience? No, because it takes a lot of people to have this fully fluent experience, and unfortunately we've all been forced, first through our history, to speak English, and secondly, just the American Society School, even today, it's a very difficult thing. So I think that we try, and I think technology might, you know, as bad as this might be, in the end, when it comes to language, it might be the thing that saves them. Because the kids are really connected to this, and they're really using it a lot, and it also means that we don't all have to be in one space. We have language classes, usually on Monday nights. Well, guess what? Everybody can't get to Charlestown on a Monday night due to everything else life holds. But as we start developing webinars and things of those nature, you can be in California and be Narragansett and still practice language. So, you know, it's an ongoing battle, but we're trying.
One of the things that people should also look at are place names. There are so many place names all over that have a meaning, and you just take them for granted. People just think, oh, you know, it's Ashaway. What does Ashaway mean? Miss Formica, or whatever the name. And the fact that out of 50 states, 25 states are native Indigenous names, I think is awesome. And most people don't recognize that or even realize.
Bella, one of our tribal members. Nice to see you.
Roger Williams recording our language, and it's one of the oldest languages recorded in the United States, Turtle Island. I mean, for me, the drum always brings me home. I hear that drum miles and miles away. I heard it in San Diego. I wanted to come home. You feel home. My question, I didn't hear anything about the ocean, and and that being such a big, big part of us. And nowadays, they have fences up, and you gotta have a VIP pass to get in, and you have to pay to get in. And now there's mansions on the ocean, and it's getting harder and harder to pray by the ocean. What can you say? What can you?
Well, I know we talked to that a teeny bit in this conversation, but I agree with you. One of the things that, the topics that you were talking about of the sort of the ownership of the land and the usurping of native lands, it comes into that because it denies us access to ceremonial spaces that are traditional to us. As Bella is mentioning, we have ceremonies that take place on the ocean. We still march ourselves down there at the wee early in the morning, but almost always we have some audience. I think the one year we didn't have some audience was because it was pouring rain. So Bella's right. The access to sacred spaces, and in this case, because the sacred space is the ocean Kikan, the ocean, we're denied it because of overdevelopment and because of privatization of what lands should be open to use by our people without restrictions, but it's not the way that it is. So I agree with her 100%, and that we need to do more to have access to those lands.
One of the things we need to look at, though, is as bad as it is and as sad as it is, the people that lost their homes in the 1938 hurricane here in Rhode Island, and 44, and the one in the hurricane, what it did in New York and New Jersey. The Creator made that ocean for all of us to use. Nobody has a right to put buildings up on land that blocks access to the ocean. The Creator every once in a while comes around and talks, and they're all wiped away. And then we're all trying to gather up and help these people that have lost their homes that shouldn't have been built there in the first place. I mean, we went to the ocean, we went there in the good season, and we knew it was time to move inland at a certain time. We didn't block the land, we didn't build on it. We had temporary shelters and homes, we-toos, wigwams. And it was the respect and honor for the ocean. And it's a loss not only for us as Indigenous people, but for all the other people. And these storms and things, the defilement of the ocean that's happened, and the things that are happening weather-wise, there's a reason why. And that Creator is telling us something, only most people aren't hearing it. All they're thinking about is the grief of people who've lost their homes, some that have lost their lives, but they shouldn't have been there in the first place.
We have a question over here.
There's a site that was discovered on the Ritzall Pond. It's supposed to be very, very old. I've only read about it in the newspaper. Do you know anything more about it? And I know, I mean, that the Narragansett been invited to be aware of that, or?
They're intricately involved in it. The whole protection of it has the Historic Preservation Department from the tribe as a partner with the state and the Department of Environmental Management, I think. They're working in concert. That no one can work on tribal fines without the tribe. It's federal law. So the tribe is very, very involved and led up by the Historic Preservation Department.
And what are they going to do? Are they going to just, is it going to be treated as an archaeological site, or are they going to, what do they hope to accomplish besides?
Well, I can't really answer that question. I don't know if anyone else can, but what I can say is this, that I know at the present moment, the goal is protection and preservation, and because, you know, of course, anything like that takes billions of dollars to excavate and do. So what I understand is the first phase is just protection and preservation. And then at some point in time, there'll be more discussion with the powers that be to decide what will be the next phase.
It had to have been a wonderful discovery for the tribe.
Of course,
Well, we
and
knew-
for all America.
But see, we knew these places were there, but we don't go around talking about them because we don't want everybody to know, because then they're gonna dig it up, tear it up,
put it someplace. I mean, Providence Place Mall is built on one of the biggest graveyards in this end of the state. And which it breaks my heart, just breaks my heart that was allowed to happen. And, you know, it might have been my great-great-great-great-grandfather that's there. I'm sure there's some of my ancestors that are there, and they're gone now. There's parking garage.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I go shop there.
Well, if there's no other questions, I'd like a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for coming out.